understand that term. So there were many reasons, many influences that drew me to writing this biography of Benjamin Butler. For one thing, as I've often referred to him as I've gotten to know him better as Forrest Butler, in reference to Forrest Gump. Anybody who does 19th century history, anyone who does Civil War history just bumps into him all the time. And that was my professional focus. And I just kept coming upon Mr. Butler in a variety of other research projects that I was doing. So I never seemed to be able to really get away from him. It was as if he was always beckoning from the distance to say, well, don't forget about me over here. I, of course, also taught at Colby for 30 years, just about, and he was a Colby alumnus, graduating from what was then known as Waterville College in 1838. So there was a sense of his presence at the college as well. In 2013, and here, let me see if I can, I'm trying to move this slide, let's see, but it's not. How can I make the slide move? Do you know, Dave?
Try one of the arrow keys on your.
I am trying the arrow key and it's doing nothing.
How about page up or page down?
Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. There's a different thing to do. Okay, so in 2013, this very enormous portrait of Benjamin Butler, which is a picture of him holding a map of Dutch Gap, was reinstalled at Colby. He brought it to the college in 1889, a few years before his death. And that for many years it hung in a prominent place on the old campus. Then it was kind of stored away. And in 2013, after it was refurbished and after some debate had gone on about whether to hang it at all, the decision was made to put it back up in the new Alumni Center. And at that time, I was asked as the Civil War historian to write a legend to go with the portrait. And I did that, and that was an interesting experience too, and drew me a little bit more into his story. Around that same time, maybe a couple of years later, I was at a conference with the great historian Gary Gallagher, whom I'm sure many of you know. And Gary and I were chatting about what I called my Chamberlain envy, because one of Colby's most important rivals here in the state of Maine is Bowdoin College, and Bowdoin is very proud of their association with Joshua Chamberlain. And of course, Joshua Chamberlain, also a very dashing figure, very highly respected, and so on. And at the time, I was feeling rather envious that, as I put it to Gary, I guess, all we had was Mr. Butler to tout as Colby College. And he took me to task for that and said, you know, really, Elizabeth, you should look into Butler a little bit more. There's a lot to be proud of there, and Colby should celebrate him. And that pushed me forward a little bit more too. I also grew increasingly curious as to why Colby was so quick and eager to celebrate Elijah P. Lovejoy, also an alumnus of Colby College from a few years before Butler, and most famous for having been such a strong supporter of freedom of the press and been murdered, become a martyr for freedom of the press. And Colby loves to support Lovejoy. The whole area supports Lovejoy. There's Lovejoy Pond, and there's Lovejoy Health Center, and there's the Lovejoy Building, and there's Lovejoy this and Lovejoy that. And I wondered why does Lovejoy get so much love and Butler gets so little up at Colby? So that was kind of an interesting question pushing me forward. And then I came upon an essay in the Colby Quarterly, which Colby doesn't publish anymore, but the library used to publish a quarterly journal. And in 1964, my predecessor at Colby, Harold Raymond, a Harvard-trained historian who was at Colby for over 40 years, 45 years before he retired, and a deeply beloved Civil War historian, he wrote an essay about Butler that was very judicious and thoughtful and detailed and careful, and really basically said that Butler needed a reassessment. And the subtitle of my book, A Noisy, Fearless Life, actually comes from the words of Harold Raymond, my predecessor, and the book is dedicated to him because he so shaped the way I approached the project. Two other things that I would mention in terms of my inspiration are that, of course, Colby, there are Butler papers all over the country, but Colby has a special trove of Butler materials. And there it was right there in our special collections and archives department. So I thought, well, that's awfully easy to get to. I don't always have to travel to Washington. I don't have to only go to New Orleans. I don't have to only go to Boston. I can spend a lot of time in our archives and special collections department, and there's a lot of material there. And so that was a bit of an inspiration too. And then finally, I would say my previous work that David mentioned on Joseph Holt. I don't know if any of you have read that book or know Joseph Holt, but he is a very prickly, complicated figure. And the memory of Joseph Holt, the way he's come down to us, is very complicated. And there's a lot of sifting that has to be done in the archival record. And I felt like my experience with Joseph Holt was good preparation for dealing with Butler, because Butler is equally complicated, beloved, despised, and so on. So I do like to say that I would not have been able to live in real life with either of these men, but I have loved them as historical subjects. So why should we stop calling Mr. Butler Beast? I used to say that at the very least, Colby alumni should stop calling him the Beast, but I really think that we all need to stop calling him Beast Butler, or at least if we're going to use that term, I can accept it if we're going to use it the way Urban Dictionary defines beast, as opposed to the way the term was applied to him, suggesting this monstrous, out of control, vicious human being. Urban Dictionary defines beast as, and I'm quoting here, a person that is extremely talented at whatever they do and always displays great determination, dedication, and resilience to always win or want to win. And this is, I think, not a perfect definition of Benjamin Butler, but it certainly applies to him in many ways. He was a very talented person. He was very determined. He had a tremendous amount of dedication, a tremendous amount of resilience, and he certainly wanted to win at anything that he did. Here's a picture, by the way, of Colby at the time that Butler went to the school, Waterville College. It doesn't look anything like this anymore. This is the old campus down by the Kennebec River, and just those three buildings basically. And now the college is up on a hill, and it's completely transformed and very modern and very fancy and completely different. He wouldn't recognize it for sure. So the way that we understand the term beast, I think, is really inaccurate for him in the depiction it gives of him, and also the way that it flattens out the life that he led and the context out of which he came and the work that he did and the contributions he made, both during the Civil War and after. So I like to talk, among other things, about his upbringing to understand him better. And this is a picture of his mother, Charlotte, whom he was deeply devoted to for his whole life. And the other picture is a picture of him as a young lawyer. Butler was actually born very poor in New Hampshire, and his mother was widowed even before Butler ever got to meet his father. And she struggled and ended up, through her financial struggles, taking the family and Butler, Benjamin Butler, to Lowell, Massachusetts, where she became a boarding house keeper. And it was there at her boarding house table, in the context of those Lowell factories, that Butler really became the person I think that he became, or forged the foundations of who he was going to be, which was somebody who was going to use his energy, his wit, his tremendous intellect, his skills, his training, his education to help people who needed the most help. And some of his earliest work after he went to Colby, he trained as a lawyer and he became an ardent advocate of factory workers, women operatives in particular, but other workers more generally. And he was an ardent fighter for the 10-hour day in Massachusetts. This was one of his first fights, and it often gets left out of the story of who he was, as if he's often described as someone who was extremely egocentric, only fought for himself, only cared about his own wealth and so on. And his early years clearly indicate that that was not the grounding that he had. When we get to the Civil War period, of course, it's really important to me to remember that while he may not have been the finest field general, the Union Army, like the Confederate Army, had an abundance of inept or not so great officers commanding soldiers in the field. And Butler was not so great, perhaps, in many of his outings on that front. But he did many, many other important things and had many skills that he brought to the work of being a civilian general that need to be remembered. Among other things, he came to the war as a leading figure in the Massachusetts state militia and was the commander of the very first federal troops to arrive in Washington to defend the capital against the much anticipated assault from the South. It was Butler's troops who were attacked in Baltimore, and it was Butler's troops who arrived in Washington first to protect the capital. He also was instrumental in those early days in maintaining Maryland for the Union. And if we recall anything about the border states, we know how important it was that those border states did not slip into the Confederacy, and the efforts to maintain their loyalty, or at least to keep them from slipping into the Confederacy, were very vigorous. And Butler was at the center of the effort to maintain Maryland's loyalty. And if you were to look at the, I'll show you another picture. This picture comes from the Harper's Weekly magazine of June of 1861, and it's attached to the lead article in the journal of that particular week. And that article suggests that in June of 1861, many Northerners believed that this was the man who was going to save the Union. So when we look back at him and talk about him as a bumbler, as a beast, as a corrupt individual, as somebody who flip-flopped politically and so on, we fail to remember how much people understood him in the early part of the war as one of the great heroes of the Union Army and one of the most likely figures, if not the most likely figure, to save the nation from this rebellion. Of course, if people know anything about Butler, any of the good things he did, they generally think about his role in crafting the contraband policy in Fortress Monroe, Virginia, in May of 1861. Here is a picture from a collection in the Colby Library of him with those 3 escaped enslaved men who came and asked for his protection. And Butler was the first general in the Union Army to refuse to return enslaved people to their masters. And this refusal cascaded through the next several months and through the war, building new helping to forge new policies in Congress, in the executive branch, and so on, around what to do with the escaped slaves in the context of this war. And I think it's really difficult to calculate how important that was. At the time that he acted, he had no clear direction from Washington. He simply had to make a decision. He kept asking the Secretary of War, what should I do? What should I do? He got no clear answers. He worked his way through to a policy in which that was grounded in the notion, this legal trickery that his intellect enabled him to come up with, that if the owners of those runaways were to come to Fort Monroe and swear loyalty to the Union and forswear their secession, then the fugitive slave law would go into effect and those enslaved people would have to return to slavery. But if the owners refused, if they said, no, in fact, we have left the United States, that would abrogate the fugitive slave law and the slaves would be able to go free, or at least have the kind of freedom that he offered at Fort Monroe, which was labor and protection, food, and so on. That decision is an extremely important decision, as I said, in terms of building the momentum towards emancipation. And among other things, if he started with 3 runaways, within weeks, he had hundreds and hundreds of runaways coming to Fort Monroe. And those runaways themselves then applied pressure on the federal government to come up with a policy. Their self-emancipation demanded legal emancipation, and so on. And Butler is the first one to take that step. Here, I just wanted to take a little detour and show you an image from the play, Ben Butler. Has anybody had a chance, I wonder, to see this play? Anyone in the group?
Not seeing any hands.
Not seeing any hands. Well, it's a wonderful play.
I have seen it, and it was excellent.
It was excellent.
Yes. The
Yes.
acting was good and the play was strong.
It was very strong. It focuses, it's called Ben Butler. It focuses on Butler's process. It's the runaways come and he's at Fort Monroe and he works through this process of how he gets to the contraband policy. And there's clearly artistic license taken. Here in this picture, the actor is, Ben Butler is talking to Shepard Mallory. The 3 enslaved men are boiled down to 1 enslaved man. And, you know, there's a lot of humor. This enslaved man, Shepard Mallory, is much more assertive and wily and jocular and aggressive perhaps than I believe any enslaved person would have been, especially towards a Union general. But I felt that even made some sense in terms of trying to represent how much slaves were responsible for their own emancipation. So I thought it was a great play, and if you have a chance ever to see it, I really do encourage you to do it. The one to see it, and one of the things that I thought was most charming when I saw it was that I thought Butler would have loved the depiction of himself. It's a very humorous depiction, but he's very smart, but also not perfect and rather cranky, and really represented all the features of Butler that I think Butler himself would have recognized about
in Scottsdale.
Pardon me?
If I can interrupt. In Scottsdale in May of next year, a community theater with which I am affiliated will be putting on the play.
Oh, super.
Be in May and June. And I've been working with the theater to set aside one of the performances that will be attended by our Roundtable, because I think we can sell the 74 seats that are available. So that project is afoot. And I know the actors and the director of the play, and I think it's going to be an amazing performance. And I read the script and I think it's terrific.
Yeah, Richard Strand, the playwright, sent me a copy of the script before, while I was working on the book. And even then I thought it was really great. And of course I sent him a copy of the book and he is mentioned in the acknowledgements. But I think it's a lovely wonderful play. I think it's really entertaining and very interesting. The one sort of takeaway that I had that was kind of a curious one, and I don't know how this will work out in the production you're talking about, but in the play I saw in Portland, Maine, Butler was presented as a very large man vis-a-vis a slave who was rather probably a foot shorter than he was. And Butler, as many of you may know, was about 5'4". He was very small, very short, and not small because he was quite rotund, but he was very short. And I thought how interesting it was to make that dramatic choice, to have him be looming over the slave. And I thought how different it would have been if it had been the other way around, visually to watch that. But it'll be interesting to see. And I hope you enjoy it. I think it's a great play, and I encourage anybody to see it if you have the chance. I want to, was there somebody else going to say something?
No, I just said thank you.
Oh, okay. New Orleans, of course, is a highlight of Butler's wartime career, and I spend a whole chapter in the book talking about New Orleans. He was there in command of Union forces, occupation forces, from April to December 1862, and it's here that he acquires this nickname, Beast, because of his willingness to execute William Mumford, who tore down the flag from the US Mint and dragged it through the city, and was then deemed a traitor and was executed. And also because of his, what came to be known as the Woman Order, whereby he decided and announced to the Confederate population, if these women continue to insult my soldiers as they have been doing, I am going to throw them in jail. And treat them like prostitutes. And this was considered by some people extremely shocking that he would do that, and very, unchivalrous and beastly. And I understand that response, I guess, but I also think we need to think about what it was that Butler was being asked to do in New Orleans, many hundreds of miles away from Washington, in this first opportunity to really demonstrate federal power on a major population in the South and repress this very violent, very riotous, very rebellious population, very complicated situation in New Orleans. And here he was, far from Washington, having to make decisions again, far from the center of power. And it's interesting to me, just as an aside, that we remember, again in quotes, that he was stern and maybe beastly, that he was very fierce and stern in his repression of the Confederacy there. And we, even in the North, even say Colby alumni, if I go up to Colby and I say I'm working on Butler, I've written a book about Butler, they'll, even there, people will say, oh yeah, Beast Butler. And I think, well, why do you remember that and not the success he achieved in suppressing the rebellion in New Orleans, which is the job he was called upon to do. Another aspect of Butler's Civil War service that I think is really important and kind of undermines this image of him as a beast, this sort of out of control, wild, fierce, and vicious person, was his advocacy for Black soldiers and the work that he did with Black soldiers, starting in New Orleans with the Louisiana Native Guard, and then in 1864 with the Army of the James in Virginia. One of the key themes in my book is who hated Butler, who loved Butler, who revered him, who called him Beast. What are these different groups about? And I will say that uniformly, or almost uniformly, Black soldiers, Black veterans, Black Americans loved and revered Butler. And the people who hated him were white Southerners, especially elite white Southerners, and rich white Republicans, many of them in Massachusetts, because he was always anti-elitist, and that followed him through his life and beyond. So, but his support for and work with and devotion to Black soldiers is very important, and it echoes through the rest of his life, all the way to his funeral, when Frederick Douglass sends an enormous tribute to his funeral. I have actually, I think this is here's a note to Butler from Frederick Douglass's son. And this is the man who he always called West. This was his manservant to whom he was very close, and whose relationship with him also reflects a kind of generalized love that many, many Black Americans had for Benjamin Butler. I'll go back one slide, and because this is a picture that that represents how he would have looked at the time that he was a representative in Congress. He was a representative in Congress for a total of 10 years, 8 years consecutively. Then he had a break. Then he came back for 2 more years. And in his work in Congress, which is perhaps the least well-known part of his story that people are encountering in the book, he led the opposition to Andrew Johnson's lenient, which is a nice way to put it, Reconstruction policies. He led the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. He actively promoted the 14th Amendment. He actively promoted the 15th Amendment and Black male suffrage. He actively promoted and was a leading figure in the Civil Rights Bill's passage. He was a leading figure in the passage of the KKK Act, the acts designed to suppress the KKK and other white supremacist groups that were very quickly rising again in the South. He was a supporter of women's rights. He was a supporter of women's suffrage. He was a supporter of workers' rights. He was a supporter of greenback currency and all kinds of other policies designed to level the economic playing field for American workers. He was a supporter of veterans' rights, and so on. So his time in Congress is extremely important in terms of understanding his overall trajectory. And again, we see this theme. He came to it slowly, but once he came to the notion of Black civil rights during the war, Black rights generally, and civil rights and political rights, he never looked back. And I think it's safe to say that he was not unlike Thaddeus Stevens, although he lived quite a bit longer, in terms of his determination to, as I've put it elsewhere, you could say stick the landing, if you were using gymnastics terminology, stick the landing of Union victory, to make Union victory have lasting transformative consequences for the nation. He worked very hard for that. And the way he is remembered by the people he tried to help along the way is very revealing. He also, of course, was governor of Massachusetts for 1 year, in the course of which, as he had in the past, this is a picture of him. These are pictures from Puck magazine. He endured, these are both from 1878, but they carry through his time as governor, these kinds of images of him, just relentless mockery from certain circles in Massachusetts. So, but in his role as governor, he also did many important things in Massachusetts. So in closing, I think it's time for us to retire the epithet beast for Mr. Butler, or at least rethink how we're using that terminology and what we mean when we say it. And I'll end just by reading this quote from my predecessor, Harold Raymond at Colby, who wrote that 1964 article about reassessing him, in which Raymond talked about Butler as a soldier, as a politician, and as a citizen. And Raymond concluded that Butler's weaknesses, as he put it, when stripped of their more dramatic overtones, were those of the typical Northern politician, businessman, and amateur soldier. He surely had his full share of failings, but his many accomplishments and successes made a substantial contribution to the preservation of the Union and the advancement of social justice in America. If Colby students, and I would add here, if Americans generally, would champion the underprivileged as fiercely and uphold the American Republic as faithfully as Benjamin Butler, they too would deserve to be honored. And I'll close by saying that I agree.